Good evening. A great Orwellian tidal wave is coming our way. It carries with it wokeism and victimhood and the rest of the deadwood leftist paraphernalia, but this is not our greatest worry. What will drown us is not these postmodernist claptraps or hors d'oeuvres of dangling drawing room conversations, no. Our greatest worry comes from the other two entities this tidal wave is carrying: negation of scientific axioms and celebration of diseases and disorders as diversity. It is the tolerance, forced or otherwise, of these two that will plunge us into an abyss. About wokeism, we know of already, this politically correct, virtue signaling, jobless automaton that brandishes a placard in a march that no one calls for or has organized. About victimhood, we know as well, this bakery round the corner from where every hypocrite picks up his daily bread. And what more needs to be said of the leftist paraphernalia, the Napoleonic, and I don't mean the king, but rather the main character of Animal Farm, the Napoleonic diktats passed off as righteous by the self-obsessed, overconfident, guilt-tripping, social Darwinian rejects of the society, managing their square meals through the few pennies thrown in their piss pots by the geriatric Hungarian jellyfishes. No, we need to focus on the other two entities: negation of scientific axioms, as I said, and celebration of disorders as diversity. Let me elaborate. Number one, on negations of scientific axioms. Remember Justice Chandrachud's utterances a few months ago that there is no absolute biological man? The only thing worse than seeing the Chief Justice of India confuse science with sociology and sex with gender was to see no one in that packed courtroom correct him. Sorry, him or her or it, depending upon how the Honorable Chief Justice identifies himself. For him to have said, not in a unsure manner, but rather emphatically, that there is no such thing as an absolute biological man was astounding. Now, I'm not saying that the Chief Justice is woke or a leftist or a snowflake, but he sure seems to be playing hopscotch over these squares. My lord, biologically, a man is one who possesses XY chromosomes and produces sperm. Biologically, a woman is one who possesses XX chromosomes and produces egg. Biologically, man cannot produce an egg. Biologically, a woman cannot produce sperm. Sex of a human is defined by the type of gamete the human possesses. There is small gamete, the sperm, and there is the large gamete, the egg. There is no third gamete. As Christian Wohlhard, development biologist and recipient of the 1995 Nobel Prize in Medicine, says, and I quote, "Sex is binary. To say that there are more than two sexes is utter nonsense and unscientific. A girl can take testosterone to grow a beard, but she will not grow testicles or produce sperm," unquote. So biologically, there indeed is an absolute definition of a man and a woman. Sociologically, they can identify themselves as a man or a woman, and no one should have a problem with that. I certainly don't. Do not confuse sex, that is biological, with gender, that is social. Besides, for a judge to interchange sex and gender raises serious medical and legal quandaries. Our laws are made keeping in mind biological and not sociological man or woman. Just imagine, you find a man's genome on a crime scene, but the judge says there's no such thing as an absolute biological man, and so a man could not have committed the crime. On a more serious note, biological man and biological women respond differently to medical treatments. Indeed, for many diseases, the treatment is tailored depending upon the sexuality. Did you know esophageal function is sex dependent? And in esophageal disease like GRD or Barrett, even esophageal cancer, the treatment is tailored on the biological sex of the patient. You can't treat a biological man like you would treat a biological woman, even if the former identified himself as a woman. This conflation of sex and gender can be devastating for practitioners of clinical medicine. Look, this is not just about toilet or locker room entry. You are already seeing biological men who identify themselves as women sweeping all the medals in sports categories hitherto meant exclusively for biological women. You already have schools declaring themselves helpless at preventing 18-year-old men entering and flashing themselves inside toilets meant for 12-year-old girls because the former identify themselves as women. A biological man called William Thomas, ranked 554th in a men's swimming category, came first and beat the record by an astonishing 38 seconds when he began competing in the equivalent women's category once he changed his name to Leah Thomas and started identifying himself as a woman. Is this fair for biological women? Just yesterday, we had this horrendous case in the Olympics where the Algerian Imane Khalif, who was disqualified, by the way, by the International Boxing Association or Federation for possessing XY chromosomes, being allowed by the Olympic Association to fight in the women's category. He fought the brave Italian Angela. The bout lasted 46 seconds. It was terrifying to watch those blows on Angela. Angela said later, she's never been hit so hard before. She said this was unfair. Sorry, Angela, but you're wrong. This was not unfair. This was criminal. I ask you, where would this end? Ironically, by peddling such statements, the Chief Justice is actually working against the interests of biological women and their rights, something they fought for centuries to get. Fact is, science tells you that any observable entity must be defined, but it also tells you that you cannot swap definitions. You can add to the definitions. You can feel you're a man. You can even sense it inherently, but that is not to say that you are biologically a man. Till date, there has not been identified a gene that controls gender identity, but even if scientists find one in the future, the definitions of gender and sex will not become interchangeable. For example, a landmark study published in the journal Science in 2019 investigating 500,000 human genomes found that there is no single gene for homosexuality. But homosexuality has a genetic component in addition to a non-genetic one. This is not to say that homosexuality is not natural. Of course it is. Likewise, gender identity is also natural. Any biological man or woman should be free to identify himself or herself any which way they want. But to conflate gender with sex would be plain wrong. Now to the second most dangerous entity, celebrating disease or disorder as diversity. We are soon entering an age where you will no longer be allowed to call a genetic disease, a genetic disorder, or a genetic syndrome a disease, a disorder, or even a syndrome. It would be called a genetic trait or a genetic attribute. Klinefelter characteristic, Down's attribute, motor neuron trait. An incapacitating malady will be called an invigorating feature. A debilitating mutation would be rephrased as a defining mutation. They will force you to live with diseases, even take pride in them, celebrate them. It has already started with obesity, has it not? Genetic disorders will be next. By the way, 1 in 700 babies born have Downs, a disorder where they have an extra copy of chromosome 21. And rightly, we call it a disorder, do we not? On the other hand, 1 in 600 babies born have Klinefelter, a disorder where they have an extra copy of chromosome X. And yet, you don't want to call it a disease or a disorder, but rather claim that it comes under the category intersex, just so you can negate the binary nature of sex and claim sex is a spectrum. You can't branch off harmful mutations and genetic deletions and additions into separate categories. They are aberrations, exceptions to the rule. That's why they occur 1 in 1,000. Don't celebrate disease or disorders as diversity, but that is exactly what you will see being done soon. This is, I am afraid, cult fighting science and overpowering it, like what the church did with Galileo. Will we allow history to repeat itself? Will we?